Despite being a poor country, Cuba has a life expectancy a year longer than the U.S., and there's a lot to learn from them. Here to talk about the Cuban biotech industry specifically and the health system more generally is Helen Yaffe, lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow, and author of We Are Cuba, to be published in a few weeks by Yale University Press. I'll have her back soon to talk about the book. Helen Yaffe. There have been reports of Cuban interferon doing important work in fighting coronavirus in China. This has been met with some skepticism from people who don't like Cuba very much. So tell us what's been going on. Just with this angle, we'll get to the Cuban biotech industry in a moment.
Oh, right. Okay. So, I published an article about Cuba's Interferon Alpha-2B. And a few people have got back to me saying, oh, well, on Wikipedia, it doesn't say it was, discovered by Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. But, there has been a lot of, as you say, censorship and misinformation, and some of it on purpose and some of it out of ignorance about Cuba's incredible medical science developments. For example, meningitis B vaccine was discovered by Cuba in a situation of great desperation and need because they had a meningitis B vaccine, B outbreak, which had killed a lot of Cubans, and they were, pulled all their resources and their specialists together. An incredible team that worked intensively to have a meningitis B vaccine. And yet, a few years ago, when the British government introduced the first meningitis B vaccine, some 30 years later, and introduced it into the National Health Service here, only for under ones at that point, they declared it was the first ever use of meningitis B vaccine in the world. So this sort of misinformation or dismissal in terms of interferon alpha-2B has precedent. I mean, it's been the norm. Would you like me to tell you the story of the interferons and how the Cubans developed them?
Well, no. Let's just, if we can. What's the extent of the work in China before we just go on to the larger story?
Okay, so the Cubans developed interferon alpha-2B, this antiviral drug, which has proven to be very useful, it seems, with the COVID-19 outbreak. They developed it in 1986. In 2003, they had a government-to-government agreement with China, and they set up a joint venture, which was called Changhe. And one of the principal products that it was set up to produce was interferon Alpha-2B, but there was a whole array of other products that were being introduced, and I think some 10 years later a new, more modern facility was opened in a different place in China. So the Chinese have been producing with Cuba the antiviral drug for many years, and when the outbreak of COVID-19 happened in Wuhan, it began very late in December, and by late January, the Chinese National Health Service had selected 30 antiviral drugs to adopt in its system to combat COVID-19, and one of them was Cuban interferon Alpha-2B. So the claim is not that it's the only drug that can help, but so far the results are that that particular antiviral drug is proving to be very effective in this virus. I mean, it has, you have to recognize that it has a long history. It's been trialed and tested, and it's proven its effectiveness in similar sorts of conditions, including things like hepatitis B and C, and even in HIV and AIDS, and also to an extent in cancer as well. So shingles it's helped with, and dengue, which was the original health condition or the original problem that the Cubans developed it to combat.
Okay, so now let's step back. The history of Cuban biotech, they were there pretty early by world standards, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Cuba's role in the biotech sector, it is the first time in history that entered a developing, emerging sector right at the beginning of its outset. And the story of that actually is about the story of how they first came to develop interferon. I mean, the background is obviously the incredible state investments in both education and healthcare, because obviously you need the education system to get the critical mass of medical scientists and medics and healthcare professionals in general. So you have that as a background. And then there was a particular scenario which led to them developing interferon. Let me just say that, just for listeners who don't know what interferons are, they are signaling proteins which are produced and released by host cells in the body in response to pathogens, so viruses, bacteria, parasites, and tumor cells. And the role that they have is to alert nearby cells to heighten their defense from this pathogen. Interferons were first discovered that they existed in 1957 by two scientists working in London. They were doing work on viral interference. And then in the 1960s, a US researcher in Paris showed that interferons could stimulate lymphocytes that attack tumors in mice. So it was seen that they could possibly be useful for cancer as well. In the 1970s, there was a US oncologist, Randolph Clark Lee, who'd taken up this research, and he caught on to the tail end of the slight improvement of relations between Cuba and the United States under Jimmy Carter's presidency, and joined a delegation to visit Cuba's healthcare facilities in the late 1970s. And during the trip, he met with Fidel Castro, who was asking him, what is the latest developments? What is the promising drugs in terms of cancer? And he talked about interferon and said, and convinced Fidel Castro that this was the wonder drug. He offered to take one researcher in his own laboratory in the US, one Cuban researcher, and Fidel Castro persuaded him to take two. So they went there and they started to gather the information, the research that had been done, and also through Clark, they made contact with someone called Kari Cantel, who was a doctor in Finland, who in that 1970s had isolated interferon from human cells, and he had not patented the procedure for doing so because he had a commitment to global public health. So he invited some Cubans to go and work with him March 1981 with him in his laboratory, learning how to produce large quantities of interferon. And they were the first generation of medical scientists who were trained entirely under the revolution of 1959. They returned in April, so not long after they returned, and moved into an old mansion that had belonged to someone before the revolution, and it was converted into an interferon laboratory, became known as the House 149. And they set to work immediately to produce their own Cuban version of interferon. And it took them just 45 days, which was incredibly quick, concentrated work. Their interferon was verified for quality in Kari Cantel's laboratory. And it turned out to be just in time, because a few weeks later, Cuba was struck by an epidemic of dengue, which is a disease transmitted by mosquitoes. But interestingly, this was a particularly virulent strand which can trigger life-threatening dengue, hemorrhagic fever. Sorry for mispronouncing that word. It's the first time it had appeared in the Americas. And the epidemic struck 340,000 Cubans, 11,000 new cases diagnosed every day at its peak. 101 children died, 180 people overall. The Cubans suspected that the CIA had released the virus onto the island. The US State Department denied it, but I have to say that a recent investigation using bioinformatic processes by the Cubans, they believe that they have confirmed that this is what happened.
Now, of course, the Cuba skeptics will say, of course they're going to say that. But, the long history of U.S. activity against Cuba makes this not at all incredible.
Well, it wouldn't be the first act of, the only act of biological warfare against Cuba. There's been swine fevers and all sorts of stuff where, the archives exist. I mean, I teach Latin American history, and actually it's a sort of normal modus operandi for the CIA is quite incredible acts of terrorism, really, against populations, whether it's economic or the application of sanctions, or helping to organize coups or supporting right-wing governments and dictatorships. So anyway, the point is that they had this outbreak, they had the interferon, the public health system, because medical science institutions are also publicly owned. So there's a lot of excellent, very fast, and they decided to use the interferon for the dengue outbreak and immediately saw the benefits, its impact in terms of reducing cases and reducing severity. So that is when they began to work on the interferon. They then took innovative turns with that research. They cloned it in yeast, and that led to the Interferon Alpha-2B Recombinant vaccine, which is being used now, which has been produced in Cuba since 1986.
I'm speaking with Helen Yaffe, lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow and author of the imminently forthcoming We Are Cuba. So now this is part of a larger, very ambitious and advanced pharmaceutical sector. Considering what a poor country Cuba is, to have this level of biotechnological sophistication is quite impressive.
Yeah. I mean, the research that I did for my book, and I have a whole chapter on the curious case of Cuba's biotech revolution, shows that biotechnology was given a priority position in their development strategy in Cuba from the 1980s, when most underdeveloped or developing countries didn't have access to any of the new technologies. The Cubans were really ahead of the game. They set up something called the Biological Front in 1981. So that was the root, in a sense, of all the biotech institutions that grew up out of that. And that received like $1 billion in the 1980s. That was only 5 years after the first biotech company was set up in the United States. And the second biotech company was only set up in 1980. So 1 year later, the Cubans essentially had a forum for developing biotechnology well before most of the world. Now, the interesting thing is, in the 1990s, Cuba has to confront this severe economic crisis with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, and it is devastating for the economy. A 35% fall in GDP, they lose 86% of their imports and exports. They're struggling to get food, to get oil. I mean, oil imports, 90% is eliminated. There's blackouts, infrastructure crumbles, everything's tumbling down. And in that period, or known as the special period, Fidel Castro insisted that the investment in biotechnology would remain, and another 1.5% of GNP was invested in biotechnology, which was an incredibly risky decision to take. But I think today we can see that it has borne. I mean, Cuba now produces almost 70% of the medicines that are consumed domestically. Now, given the context of the United States blockade, which we should all know includes food and medicine, as well as educational equipment and cultural links and so on, that has been really important for the health and well-being of the Cuban people.
The larger Cuban health system, I imagine they have some sort of a comprehensive national health care system, but what does that look like exactly?
Well, I mean, Cuba has more doctors per person than anywhere in the world. And their approach to healthcare is that prevention is better than cure. But the other interesting approach of their healthcare is they don't separate the sort of medical diagnostics from an assessment of people's social and environmental factors. So they have a biosocial environmental approach to medicine. They have an incredible system of family doctors. So the number of doctors per people is so high because everybody has access to a family doctor on more or less each street, each area. And the family doctors are open in the morning to receive patients, and in the afternoon they do home visits. And this is where the approach of considering the medical situation of an individual within the framework of their social and environmental factors is so important. So they visit their patients, they check how they are, they look at other additional problems they may have, like fridges not working, which means they can't keep food fresh or whatever it is. Then they have a secondary system, which is a system of polyclinics where you would go for small treatments, minor surgery, and other consultations. And then finally, they have the hospital system. But when you consider that at the time of the revolution, or in the months and years following, Cuba was reduced to not much over 3,000 doctors and very few hospitals, and essentially healthcare in the rural areas was non-existent. There was some possibility of getting some treatment for poorer people in Havana on a charitable basis and so on, but it was very difficult to get any access to healthcare. And today, the other aspect of Cuban healthcare is it's not concentrated around the island. And their focus has been to treat people in their communities. So this is one of the benefits of their approach in terms of biotechnology. They have worked a lot with immunotherapies. So recently, they have had breakthroughs with cancer immunotherapies, which were very difficult nut to crack, and others had not been successful. And one of the benefits of this is that this provides treatment that can be delivered by an injection in a local or rural hospital without requiring patients to travel into big cities and go into expensive, technologically complex hospital scenarios. So it's also very much cheaper to deliver, and it can be delivered for people in their own communities.
And they export a lot of doctors too, right? Venezuela, Africa. This is they spread their wealth, their medical wealth around the world.
Yeah, I mean, they have an incredible record. Something like 400,000 Cuban healthcare professionals have worked overseas. And initially, this was in response to emergencies or to support struggling, public healthcare systems. It was acts of solidarity. Sometimes they sent people to countries, many times I should say, they sent people to countries where they didn't even have diplomatic relations with the government or had quite hostile relations with the government. But it was an act of solidarity, not concerned about the government, but concerned about the populations affected by whatever health crisis had happened. Subsequently, they got in a situation with the exchange of oil for doctors with Venezuela, where it was clear that this could also be a source of revenues for the Cubans. And, we have to remember the context that the United States blockade of Cuba means that their options in terms of economic engagement with the world are limited, because the US pursues, it doesn't just stop its own US trade with Cuba, it also attempts to persecute any other countries or individuals in third countries who are trading with Cuba.
Now, there was some hostile coverage at the time, as I recall, that these doctors were being pressed into service and woefully underpaid, essentially drafted so the state could make some money off them. What about that?
The Cuban government receives the payment that has been agreed by the host country, if that is the contract that they are operating under. There's about 6 different contracts that the Cubans operate under when they send medics abroad, including the free assistance. So the Cuban government takes the salaries and pays to the Cubans a small proportion of that. But this can only be understood within the framework of a socialist, centrally planned economy. None of those doctors have paid a penny for any of their education. If you think about the situation of doctors in the United States, I mean, you will know better than me that their education, medical education, is seen as an investment. It costs an awful lot of money. And the justification is that they then have to charge high salaries in order to be able to pay their debt. So Cuban doctors qualify, they graduate with no debt. But not only that, their children will then enter the Cuban education system and also graduate with no debt. I think it's 90% of Cubans own their own homes. So they're not burdened by the fear of eviction for non-payment, whether it's a mortgage or rental. So yes, the salaries are low that the Cubans receive, but it is seen that their education, their passing through the system, their graduation is a social investment. And so the country should nationally benefit from that investment, because that money is ploughed back into the same system from which they have benefited.
Finally, all these Cuban drugs, which are helping in China, I assume because of the U.S. embargo, this is certainly not available in the U.S. Are any other countries looking to it, or is this mostly a Chinese affair?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've read reports that something like 15 countries are currently requesting access to Cuba's Interferon Alpha-2B. The other interesting story developing is that Cuba and China have sent medical specialists to Italy. And there are people in Spain and France who are also clamoring and saying, we need this Cuban antiviral drug, and B, we need their medical expertise. So, the Cubans have shown that they are prepared to go anywhere their healthcare workers are needed. During Hurricane Katrina, thousands of Cuban doctors gathered together in the airport in Havana with their backpacks ready with emergency equipment and ready to go at a moment's notice to leave their families behind and fly over to New Orleans and the other affected areas to provide emergency assistance to the people affected by Hurricane Katrina. And that offer was turned down. It was actually ignored. Cuba wasn't even on the list of countries that had offered assistance produced by the president at that time. So, I think this is something that people should be considering. If we know there is an effective antiviral drug, by no means the only, but the Cubans have the capacity with the Chinese to produce this en masse. I think it's really something that we should be demanding access to.
That was Helen Yaffe, a lecturer at the University of Glasgow and author of We Are Cuba, forthcoming from Yale University Press. That's it for me, Doug Henwood.